The pocket watch hit the counter between them like a gunshot. Harriet Quinn's hand was trembling. She could feel it, hated it, willed it to stop, but her fingers had released the thing before she could change her mind, before the last 6 months of grief and guilt and sleepless nights could pull her back from the door of the Archer Ranch one more time. The watch spun once on the worn oak surface and settled face up, its engraved silver case catching the afternoon light that poured through the dusty window. She had polished it that morning. She did not know why. She had told herself it was respect. Joseph Archer had not moved since she walked in. He stood on the other side of the kitchen counter, tall, dark-haired, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red rock as the New Mexico territory itself, and he was staring at the watch with an expression she could not read and desperately needed to. His dark eyes moved from the watch to her face, and something happened in them. Something shuddered, something raw. "Where did you get that?" he said, not a question. The quietest words she had ever heard spoken with the most violence underneath them. "Your father left it to my husband." She kept her chin up. She had practiced this. When they were partners, before the war changed everything. "Before your father," she stopped, chose the next words carefully, the way a person steps through thin ice. "Before everything that happened between our families. My father is dead, Mrs. Quinn. I know. My father died 3 months ago, and your husband killed him." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the loudest, most crowded silence Harriet had ever stood inside. It pressed against her eardrums and pushed against her ribs and made the simple act of breathing feel like a negotiation. "My husband is also dead," she said quietly. "He died owing your father a debt he never had the chance to repay. I came to return what should have been yours. I want nothing else from you. I expect nothing else." She turned to leave. "Mrs. Quinn." She stopped, her hand on the door frame. She did not turn around because she was not entirely certain her composure would survive turning around. "Stay," Joseph Archer said, and then, like the word had surprised even him, "Please." Harriet Quinn had buried one man she did not love enough. She had told herself she would never again stand in a room and feel something she had no business feeling. She had told herself a great many things in the past 6 months, riding alone across the high desert, watching the stars move and the coyotes pace and the red earth turn gold with morning. She had told herself she was finished. She turned around, and that is where it truly began, not in that kitchen, not in that moment, but in everything that had come before it, the long and tangled and deeply human road that had carried 2 very wounded people to the same counter, to the same watch, to the terrifying threshold of something neither of them had asked for, and both of them needed more than air. Harriet Calloway had arrived in Cimarron, New Mexico territory, in the spring of 1874 as a bride. She was 24 years old, brown-haired and green-eyed, with steady hands trained by a childhood in a Boston apothecary, and a mind trained by too many books and too many winters alone. She had answered an advertisement placed by a man named Douglas Quinn, a cattle rancher of 41 years who had offered a plain but decent life in exchange for a capable wife. She had read that advertisement 12 times and written back on the 13th reading, when her father's debts had finally swallowed the apothecary and left her with nothing but her own quiet intelligence and a willingness to do hard things. Douglas Quinn was not a cruel man. She wanted to be honest about that, even now. He was not kind in the ways she had imagined kindness, not warm or curious or interested in the things that interested her, but he was not cruel. He worked hard and expected her to work hard and paid fair wages to the men who rode for him and never raised his hand to her. She had called that a good marriage and convinced herself it was true for 3 years. What she had not known when she married him, what no one in Cimarron had thought to mention in their letters to a bride traveling from Boston, was the history between the Quinn Ranch and the Archer spread 15 miles to the north. Walter Archer and Douglas Quinn had once been friends. More than friends, they had built the Cimarron Valley together in the early 1860s, had worked side by side fencing land and running cattle, and fighting off the kind of men who preyed on settlers. They had borrowed tools and shared water rights and eaten at each other's tables. They had, by all accounts, been the kind of partners who made the frontier bearable. Then the war had come. Not the big war, not the war between the states, though that shadow fell over everything, but their own smaller, bitterer war. A water rights dispute that had calcified into something uglier. A deal gone wrong, money that changed hands and was never accounted for, accusations that became threats that became two families who could not share the same end of Cimarron's main street without violence simmering at the surface. Harriet had married into one side of this war without a map. She learned it slowly. The tightening of Douglas's jaw whenever anyone mentioned the Archers. The way the ranch hands avoided riding north. The single, massive argument she witnessed in the summer of 1875, when Walter Archer appeared at their fence line, and the two old friends stood 50 yards apart in the August heat, and said things to each other that stripped every pretense of civility away and left only the bones of a long and poisonous betrayal underneath. She had watched from the porch, unable to hear the words but able to feel the temperature of them, and she had thought, "I do not understand this place. I may never understand this place." But she had stayed because she had made a promise, and because she was not a woman who walked away from promises, and she had tried to build something real inside the walls of what she had. In the fall of 1877, Douglas Quinn rode north one night and did not come back by morning. The sheriff found him the following afternoon, alive but barely, in a ravine on the edge of Archer land. He died 4 days later without being entirely clear about what had happened. The only witnesses were a scatter of bootprints in the red dirt, and the fact that Walter Archer was found dead in the same ravine by the same sheriff 2 days after Douglas. No one was ever charged with anything. The sheriff of Cimarron, a cautious man named Hendricks who understood the value of not igniting a range war, recorded both deaths as misadventure and filed the paperwork and moved on. But the town had its theories, and theories in a small place like Cimarron had the staying power of stone. The prevailing theory was that Douglas Quinn and Walter Archer had finally, after 15 years of escalating hostility, killed each other. Harriet did not know if this was true. She had her own quiet, private certainty about pieces of it, certainty she could not share without revealing things she had no proof of, things she had seen and heard and filed away in the careful archives of her own mind. What she knew for certain was this. When she had gone through Douglas's belongings after his death, she had found a pocket watch at the back of his top drawer that did not belong to him. She had recognized it immediately, because she had seen Walter Archer hold it at the fence line argument 2 years before, had watched him turn it in his hands, a nervous habit, while he and Douglas destroyed what was left of their friendship. It was a beautiful thing, silver, engraved with the initials WRA on the case, and a small hunting scene on the back. She had asked Douglas about it once, and he had looked at her with an expression that closed every door and said, "That is not something you need to concern yourself with, Harriet." She had let it go, because she had learned to let things go in this marriage. But she had not forgotten. After Douglas died, after the long winter of widowhood had settled over the Quinn ranch, quieter than her marriage but not, she found, lonelier, she had thought about the watch constantly. It sat in her own bureau now, because she could not bring herself to leave it in Douglas's room, and it weighed on her in the way that unfinished things do. It belonged to the Archers. More specifically, it now belonged to Joseph Archer, Walter's only son, who had returned to Cimarron from Texas sometime in the previous year to settle his father's estate, and by all the accounts she gathered from careful listening in the general store, and the post office had been running the Archer spread alone ever since. She knew almost nothing about him except that he was younger than she had expected, around 30, people said, and that he kept to himself the way a man keeps to himself when he has too many sharp edges and not enough safe places to put them. She had ridden north in the middle of April, on a morning so clear and blue it felt almost like an insult to the seriousness of her errand, with the watch in her coat pocket and a speech rehearsed so carefully it had almost lost its meaning by the time she reached the Archer gate. She had not expected him to be standing in the kitchen doorway when she dismounted, watching her with those dark, unreadable eyes. She had not expected the way her prepared speech dissolved into something simpler and more honest the moment she actually saw his face. She had not expected him to ask her to stay. But he had, and she had turned around, and now she was standing in the kitchen of the enemy's house with her hands clasped in front of her and her heart doing something complicated and probably unwise. "Sit down," Joseph said. He was already moving toward the stove, putting the kettle on with the automatic efficiency of a man who had spent too many hours alone and had made a private ritual of the small civilities. "I'll make coffee. And then you can tell me how my father's watch ended up in your husband's house, because I have been wondering about that for 3 months and I would very much like to know the truth of it." "I'm not certain I know the whole truth," she said honestly. "Whatever portion you do know would be more than I have right now." She sat. The kitchen was spare but not unloved. A woman's touches remained here and there, the kind that outlast the woman herself. A blue curtain at the window, slightly faded. A ceramic crock on the shelf with a painted flower. She did not ask about Joseph's mother. She had heard that Eleanor Archer had died young, years before all this, and that Walter had raised Joseph mostly alone on this land. "Tell me about your father," she said instead as the coffee came. "Tell me what you knew about the trouble between them. I will tell you what I knew. And perhaps between the two of us we can build something like the whole picture." He set the coffee in front of her and sat across the counter on a stool, and the watch lay between them like a small silver heart, and he looked at it for a long time before he looked at her. "My father told me that your husband stole from him," Joseph said. "Not money, worse than money. He told me Douglas Quinn took a water rights agreement they had made, a real one, written and signed and witnessed, and had it quietly voided by a land lawyer he knew in Santa Fe. He told me the lawyer was paid, that the whole thing was arranged, and that when my father discovered it there was nothing he could do because the paperwork was already filed and the witnesses were already bought." Harriet sat very still. "Do you know when this happened?" 69, maybe 70, before you arrived, before any of it got as bad as it did." "I didn't know about the water rights document," she said, "but I knew there was something. The way Douglas talked about your father, or rather, the way he refused to talk about him, there was guilt in it. I could always tell the difference between his anger and his guilt, even if I couldn't always identify the source." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "I found letters in his desk after he died, letters from the Santa Fe lawyer. They do not spell out what happened, not exactly, but they confirm there was an arrangement. I thought about bringing those to Sheriff Hendricks, but Hendricks had already closed the case and wasn't looking for reasons to reopen it." "Yes." Joseph's jaw tightened. "My father spent the last 8 years of his life trying to get that water rights agreement restored. It cost him 2 lawyers and a significant portion of what he'd saved. He didn't win. The water went to your husband's land, which meant every dry summer was harder for us than it should have been, and the last 2 summers before my father died were very dry." "I'm sorry," Harriet said, and she meant it, not the reflexive apology of social courtesy, but the deep, bone-weary sorry of a person who has been an unwitting participant in something wrong and carries the weight of that participation regardless of her innocence in the act. Joseph looked at her when she said it. Really looked at her, the kind of looking that takes a measure of a person and does not pretend to be anything else. "You didn't do it," he said. "No. But I benefited from it, living on that land, drinking that water. So did I, living on this one, the years before it was taken." He exhaled slowly. "I'm not interested in punishing you for your husband's sins, Mrs. Quinn. I was worried when you came through that gate that you were here about the land claim, that you'd come to tell me Douglas had some arrangement that gave your ranch a legal interest in the Archer property or something else like that, something I'd have to fight." He paused. "I've been fighting things for a while. I am very tired of fighting things. "I came to return a watch," she said quietly. "That is all." "That is not all," he said, and his voice was not accusing, just precise. "A woman doesn't ride 15 miles across hard country to return a pocket watch she could have sent with the postal stage. You came to say something. Tell me the rest of it." She looked at him steadily. He was right. She had told herself it was just the watch, but there was more, and she was not in the habit of lying to herself even when the truth was uncomfortable. "I came because I have been carrying the weight of what my husband did, and I needed to put it down somewhere it belonged," she said. "I know that is not a clean explanation. I know it sounds like I am making my guilt your problem. But the watch was a part of it, and I wanted you to have it, and I thought if I could return it in person and tell you what I know and look you in the eye and tell you I am sorry, that might be close enough to justice to let me breathe again." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. "It helps," Joseph said finally. "More than I expected." She nodded. She should have stood up then. She should have thanked him for the coffee and walked back out to her horse and ridden the 15 miles home and started the business of figuring out what her life looked like now that the weight was lighter. That is what a sensible woman would have done. "Those dry summers," she said instead. "Do you have enough water now? Is there a creek that still runs through your north pasture?" He blinked. Then, with what she recognized as the kind of surprise a person feels when someone asks a question that is actually useful, "There is, but it runs low in July and August. We manage. There's a spring on the south edge of the Quinn property, the property that was in dispute. It feeds into the same aquifer as your North Pasture Creek. I found it 2 years ago when I was mapping the fence lines. Douglas didn't know about it, or if he did, he never developed it." She paused. "I would be willing to discuss a water-sharing arrangement. A real one, properly drawn, not voided by a Santa Fe lawyer, if that would be useful to you." Joseph Archer stared at her. Then something happened in his expression that she would think about for a long time afterward, a careful, slow unlocking, like a door that had been bolted from the inside for so long the bolt itself had grown stiff. "Why would you do that?" he said. "Because it is right," she said. "And because I am also tired of fighting things, and I find I would rather build something than fight something, if the option is available." She left an hour later. She rode home with the watch no longer in her pocket and something strange in its place, not emptiness, not relief, but the peculiar sensation of a beginning she had not planned for and was not entirely certain she was ready for. She came back 2 weeks later with a surveyor's map of the spring. He was in the north pasture when she arrived, mending a section of fence that the winter had heaved out of alignment. She could see him from the gate, the dark shape of him against the red earth and the blue sky, moving with the efficient, unsentimental motions of a man who did work, because work needed doing and did not perform it for any audience. She tied her horse at the gate and walked out to him across the dry spring grass, and he heard her coming and turned around, and there was something in the way his face changed when he recognized her that she tucked away in the careful archives of her mind, next to the memory of the unlocking. "Mrs. Quinn," he said. "I brought the survey map I mentioned," she said, "and some legal language I drafted for the water-sharing arrangement. I had a look at what my husband's lawyer had filed in Santa Fe. I can access the public records, and I understand why it was invalid. I think I've written something that can't be voided the same way, but I'd want you to have your own lawyer review it." He took the papers from her. He was wearing work gloves, and he stripped one off to handle the documents, and she noticed his hands, the kind of hands that told a complete story, scarred and capable and careful all at once. "You drafted this yourself," he said, scanning the first page. "I helped my father with his business documents from the time I was 14. A pharmacy in Boston generates a considerable amount of paperwork." She paused. "I also read a good deal." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but the suggestion of one, like a word that almost gets spoken. "I can see that," he said. He invited her in for coffee again. She accepted. They sat in the kitchen with the survey map spread between them, and talked about water rights and property law and the particular geography of the Cimarron Valley. And somewhere in the middle of this deeply practical conversation, Harriet realized she was more interested in the way Joseph Archer's mind worked than in anything they were actually discussing. He was not an educated man in the formal sense. She doubted he'd had much schooling past what a frontier childhood allowed, but he thought rigorously and questioned precisely, and was not afraid to say when he did not understand something, which in her experience was rarer than any formal credential. She rode home in the blue dusk with her empty map case and a head full of thoughts that were not about water rights. The third time she came north, she did not have a specific reason. She told herself she was checking on the fence line that ran near the property boundary, which was technically true in the sense that she did check on it for approximately 4 minutes before continuing north to the Archer Gate. She arrived to find Joseph in the barn, which was large and old, and smelled beautifully of hay and horses and wood smoke from the small stove in the corner, attempting to explain something to a young horse that was not interested in being explained to. She stood in the barn doorway for a moment before he noticed her watching. He was talking to the horse, not coaxing, not commanding, but actually talking in a low, steady voice, telling it what was about to happen and why. It was the kind of patience that could not be performed. Either you had it or you didn't. "He's afraid of the hoof pick," she said from the doorway. Joseph turned. The horse startled and then settled as he kept one hand on its shoulder. "I noticed," he said. "What makes you say that?" "He's not resistant across the board. He let you put the halter on and he stood for brushing. I saw that from the gate. It's the specific moment you try to lift his feet that he objects. Something happened to one of his hooves that frightened him." Joseph looked at the horse. "That would explain why the man I bought him from gave me such a good price," he said dryly. "May I?" He stepped back, which was, she thought later, a significant kind of trust for a man who had spent years having no reason to trust anyone. She approached the horse slowly, talking as she went. The same low, steady patter she had used on her father's delivery horse as a girl, the one that had gotten spooked by a streetcar and spent the rest of its life edgy and suspicious. She let the horse smell her hand, let him process her presence, then ran her hand down his shoulder and neck with the particular pressure she had learned was neither too light nor too heavy. When she asked for his foot the first time, he pulled it. The second time he gave it, and she held it briefly and set it down gently and made no more of the whole thing than that. The horse blew a long breath through his nose and relaxed his hindquarters. "Where did you learn that?" Joseph said. He was leaning against the barn wall with his arms crossed, and an expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of impressed, which, she suspected, looked different from other people's versions. "Necessity, mostly. That and my father had a book on veterinary medicine on the pharmacy shelf that I read at least a dozen times." She stood up, brushing hay from her skirt. "What's his name?" "I've been calling him Trouble. Unfair to give an animal a name that predicts his behavior." "What would you call him?" She considered the horse, who was watching her with large, liquid eyes that had more intelligence in them than his previous resistance had suggested. "Pilgrim," she said. "He's just trying to find his way somewhere safe." Something crossed Joseph's face that had nothing to do with the horse. He was quiet for a moment and then, "Will you stay for supper?" It was the first time he had asked her anything beyond coffee. She recognized the weight of it, the way the question was carefully positioned to sound simple, because he would not press or presume but had still needed to ask it. "Yes," she said. "I will." They cooked together in the kitchen that had been Eleanor Archer's and then Walter Archer's and was now only Joseph's, and Harriet found herself thinking about how a house holds its people even after they are gone, how every room has a kind of memory. Joseph was a competent cook in the plain, practical way of a man who had fed himself alone for a long time, and she sliced bread and set the table. And there was something in the ordinary domesticity of it that felt less like something temporary and more like something that had always existed and was only now becoming visible. They talked through supper and after supper, sitting on opposite sides of the kitchen table with coffee cooling in their cups, and she discovered things. That he had spent 4 years in Texas working cattle drives before coming home to settle his father's estate, that he had found the Archer Ranch in worse condition than the letters had suggested, that he had been slowly, methodically rebuilding it. That he had been in love once, years ago, with a woman in Abilene who had married a railroad man instead, and that he spoke of this without bitterness, but with the honest acknowledgement that it had shaped his subsequent caution about hoping for things. That his mother had died when he was 7 fever, the kind that came through the valley that bad winter, and that he still missed her in the abstract, particular way of a person who barely had the shape of someone to miss. She told him about Boston, about the apothecary and her father's complicated relationship with debt, about the long months of considering Douglas Quinn's advertisement before writing back, about arriving in New Mexico territory in the spring, and finding that the West was more beautiful and more harsh and more alive than she had imagined, and that she had been determined to belong to it even when it did not make that easy. "Did you ever love him?" Joseph asked. He asked it simply, without cruelty, the way a person asks a question they genuinely need the answer to. "I tried," she said. "I was not able to in the end, not the way I had hoped to love someone, but I respected him and I honored my commitment to him, and I grieve him honestly, which is not the same as loving him but is not nothing either." That is a more honest answer than most people would give. "I've found dishonesty to be very inefficient," she said, "especially with oneself." He walked her out to her horse at full dark, the stars brilliant overhead in that extravagant New Mexican way, the Milky Way so clear it looked like something a person could touch. He held the stirrup for her as she mounted, which was courteous, and then kept his hand on the bridle for a moment, which was not strictly necessary. "Come back," he said, "just that." "I will," she said. She did. May turned to June on the high desert, and Harriet Quinn rode north more frequently than any practical errand justified, and Joseph Archer began to time his day around the possibility of her arrival without acknowledging to himself that this was what he was doing. She brought books sometimes. She had a small but excellent collection, and left 2 with him that she thought he would like, a novel and a book of natural philosophy that she had worn the covers off reading. He read both within a week, and the next time she came, they talked about them for 2 hours, and she thought, "This is the most interesting conversation I have had in years. This is what I have been hungry for without knowing it was a specific hunger and not just a general ache." He was not an easy man to know. There were rooms in him, she was beginning to understand this, that were closed not out of deceit, but out of genuine uncertainty about whether they were safe to open. He had been his father's son in a hard place for a long time, and his father had not been a demonstrative man, and the frontier did not reward vulnerability in men, and the sum of all of this was someone who felt things deeply and moved toward them slowly and required, above everything else, to believe that the approach was honest. She was scrupulously honest with him. Not performatively, not the honesty that announces itself, but the quiet, consistent kind that is simply the fabric of how a person moves through the world. She said what she thought. She admitted when she did not know something. She did not pretend the history between their families was simpler than it was, or that her motives for coming north were purely practical, or that the afternoons she spent in his kitchen and his barn, and walking the fence lines of his land were not the best afternoons she had spent in years. In June, she brought a picnic. She told herself it was practical. She was already riding north. She had food prepared. It was efficient, and she was aware, distantly, that she was negotiating with herself in a way that suggested she understood the significance of what she was doing, and was choosing to do it anyway. She arrived to find him on the porch with a piece of harness that needed mending, and he looked at the basket she was carrying, and something in his expression went warm in a way that undid her careful composure slightly at the edges. They ate on the flat rock above the North Pasture Creek, where the cottonwood trees threw good shade, and the water ran cool and clear over the red stones. She had made cold chicken and cornbread, and there were early summer apples from the Quinn orchard, small and tart, and they sat in the shade and ate and talked and watched Pilgrim picking his way along the creek bank below, entirely at ease now, the skittishness slowly resolving as the weeks passed, the same way that everything in this valley seemed to be slowly resolving. "I have been thinking about the spring," Harriet said, when they had eaten and were sitting in the comfortable silence that had developed between them. The kind that is not silence at all but a form of conversation, a mutual ease of presence. About whether it makes more sense to develop it jointly, with a shared cost, or whether I should develop it on my side and we establish a formal usage agreement. "What are the costs on each approach?" She outlined them. He asked questions. They worked through the numbers together in the precise, practical way they had developed for discussing the land, and which she had privately come to think of as their own language, the shared vocabulary of two people who were too careful and too scarred to be immediately fluent in the other languages they might otherwise have chosen. "Joint development is better long-term," he said finally. "Costs more upfront, but the infrastructure is yours and mine both, which makes any future arrangement more stable. That's my assessment as well. We'd have to put it in writing, properly." "I know a good approach to writing agreements," she said. He looked at her, that warm unlocking again, slow and inevitable as sunrise. "Harriet," he said, the first time he had used her given name without planning to, without the formal prefix, just the name itself, direct as an arrow. She held very still. "I think you know this isn't only about the spring," he said. "I know," she said. "I think you've known for a while. Since April," she said honestly. "Since the kitchen the first day." "I'm sorry if that seems too fast. I am aware that it is too fast. I am aware that there are very good reasons to be cautious, and I intend to be cautious. I am simply being honest with you about the fact that I have a feeling I am trying to be cautious about." He reached over and picked up an apple from the cloth between them and turned it in his hands the way his father had turned that pocket watch, and she thought, the body finds its habits across generations. "I have not been particularly successful at being cautious about it either," he said. "I keep telling myself there are reasons, the history between our families, the talk it would cause in town, the fact that—" He paused. "You're still in mourning." "I was in mourning," she said carefully. "I am in that particular stage that comes after grief when you are trying to figure out what you were actually mourning. I did not love Douglas the way a wife should love a husband. I mourned the marriage I did not have and the years spent inside something that was never quite right. I am finished mourning those things. I spent the winter doing it very thoroughly." Joseph looked at her for a long moment. "The town will talk," he said. "A Quinn and an Archer. The town talks about everything and is always wrong about most of it. I am not particularly motivated by what the town chooses to say about me. I could not give you what Douglas gave you, in terms of property or position. I am not interested in what Douglas gave me in terms of property or position," she said, with a directness that surprised even her. "I am interested in—" She stopped, started again. "I am interested in the way you talk to a frightened horse, and the way you read a book and actually think about what it is saying, and the way you asked me to stay that first day when you had every reason in the world not to. Those are the things I am interested in, Joseph." It was the first time she had used his given name. The cottonwood leaves moved overhead, green gold in the afternoon light. The creek talked to itself below. Pilgrim lifted his head and looked up at them for a moment and then went back to grazing, entirely unconcerned with the complicated human business being conducted above him. Joseph Archer leaned across the cloth and pressed his lips to her forehead, very briefly and very gently, with the care of a man who understands the weight of a gesture and does not waste it. She closed her eyes and felt the warmth of it spread through her like the first real warmth after a long winter and thought, there it is. There is the thing I had given up expecting. He pulled back. His dark eyes were close and serious. "I need to go slow," he said. Not because the feeling isn't there. Because I am the kind of man who needs to build things right or they fall down. I've seen too many things fall down. "I don't want fast," she said. "Fast is what happens when two people are careless. I have no interest in being careless with this." He nodded. The gravity in his face lightened slightly, the way a sky clears after a storm has passed without breaking. "Then we build it right," he said. Summer progressed and they built it right. He came south to her ranch twice in July, which was an occasion in itself. The first time an archer had set foot on Quinn land in peaceful purpose, in longer than anyone could clearly remember. The ranch hands, her 3 remaining men, watched Joseph's arrival with expressions that ranged from suspicious to openly fascinated, and Harriet introduced him as a neighbor and business associate, and did not attempt to explain anything else, because it was not yet anything else in any formal sense, and she refused to claim more than she had. But she noticed things. The way her foreman, Cass, who had ridden for Douglas for 12 years and was constitutionally inclined toward loyalty to the man he'd served, watched Joseph mend a fence post he'd noticed listing on his way in, had simply stopped, without being asked, and fixed the thing, and how Cass's expression shifted from suspicion to a reserved, evaluating kind of respect. The way Joseph spoke to the hands as equals, which was not universal in ranchers, and was something Harriet had always thought mattered. The way he stood in her kitchen and looked at her father's medical books on the shelf she kept, and his face went genuinely interested, genuinely curious. She had hung a portrait of her father on the wall of the study, a small daguerreotype in a leather frame. Joseph stopped in front of it one afternoon when she was making coffee, and she came back to find him standing there looking at it with that particular stillness he had. "Your father?" he asked. "Yes. He died the year before I came west. His heart. You look like him around the eyes." She came to stand beside him and looked at the small portrait. "He would have liked you," she said, which was absolutely true and which she had not entirely intended to say out loud. Joseph turned to look at her, a slow quarter turn, very close in the small study. "What makes you say that?" "You ask the right kind of questions. He always said the only good measure of a person's intelligence was the quality of their questions, not their answers." She paused. "And you fixed the fence post without being asked." "A listing fence post is a problem waiting to happen," he said, slightly bewildered, as though this were obviously true and needed no special credit. "I know," she said. "That's what I mean." The water sharing agreement was filed in Santa Fe in late July, reviewed by separate lawyers, and found to be exactly as sound as Harriet had written it. When the documentation came back with the territorial seal on it, Joseph brought it south to her, riding the 15 miles in the July heat, arriving in the long gold afternoon. She made lemonade. She had preserved lemons specifically for this, and was not going to examine that decision too closely, and they sat on the porch in the shade and looked at the signed, sealed papers and felt the satisfaction of having done something right. "I want to show you something," he said, after they had sat a while. He reached into his vest pocket and brought out the silver watch. She had not seen it since she left it on his counter in April. He held it out to her, not giving it to her, just sharing the looking. She took it gently. The silver was warm from being close to him. She turned it over and looked at the hunting scene on the back, the hounds and the trees, and then opened the case. The mechanism was beautiful. The dial was hand-painted, small flowers on the rim. She had not noticed in April the inscription inside the case lid, "For Walter, with all that I am, Alina." His mother. She looked up at him. "She gave it to him when they married," Joseph said. "He told me that the last time we talked. He said she'd saved for 6 months working as a seamstress to buy it before they came west. Said it was the most valuable thing he owned, and he kept it in the desk drawer because he was afraid of losing it on the range." He paused. "I don't know what Douglas Quinn was doing with it. I've thought about it. My best guess is that things got violent before the end and my father had it in his pocket that night and your husband took it. Either deliberately or just as something that happened in a struggle. I'll never know for certain." "I'm sorry," she said again. "You don't have to keep apologizing for him." "I'm apologizing for the world that let it happen," she said. "For all of it. For 2 men who couldn't find any way to resolve what was between them except by destroying each other. For the years it cost both families, for the waste of it. Joseph reached out and took the watch back gently, and for a moment their fingers overlapped on it, warm silver between their palms, and neither of them moved. "My mother's ring is in the desk in the study," he said. "I found it when I was settling the estate. My father kept it with the watch." He paused, and she could feel him choosing his next words with the care he brought to things that mattered enormously. "I am not going to say anything precipitate about that. I am telling you it exists because I want you to know that I am thinking about the future. That I am not, that this is not. I know what this is," she said softly. "Good." He put the watch back in his pocket. "Good." August arrived with all its ferocity, the relentless heat, the dry creak of the land, the spectacular violet thunderstorms that built over the mountains in the afternoons, and sometimes delivered rain, and sometimes delivered only thunder and lightning, and went off to rain on some other part of the territory. The spring that Harriet had found on the Quinn property, now jointly developed with a proper pump and a shared pipe system, was running well, and the Archer North Pasture Creek held its level through the worst of the dry weeks in a way it had not held in years. Harriet rode out one evening in late August to check the pump, which she had been monitoring twice a week, and found Joseph already there doing the same. They looked at each other across the pump housing in the warm evening, and both of them smiled, which was something she had been noticing, how naturally they smiled when they were in the same space, how the expression arrived without being summoned, the involuntary response of something genuinely pleased. "It's holding," she said. "It's holding," he agreed. They walked back to the Archer gate together, leading their horses, talking about nothing in particular, an interesting piece of news from the territorial newspaper, a bird she had seen on the north fence that he confirmed as a vermilion flycatcher, the kind of conversation that is its own pleasure independent of any content. At the gate he took her hand to help her mount, and she was already in the saddle before she realized his hand had not let go. She looked down at him. He was looking up at her with those serious dark eyes, and the August evening was turning copper and rose behind him, and she thought, "I have never been so sure of anything in my life, and I have been very careful about being sure of things." "Harriet," he said. "Yes," she said before he had asked anything, because she knew what the question was, and the answer was not something that required any more deliberation. He let out a breath. "I need to do this properly. I need to." He paused. "Can you come to supper on Saturday? I want to cook something that isn't just whatever is in the pantry. I want to ask you something properly." "You can ask me now," she said. "I promise the answer will be the same Saturday." "The ring deserves a proper occasion," he said, with a gravity that made her chest ache in the best possible way. "Then I will come to supper on Saturday," she said. She rode home with the copper evening around her and thought about Eleanor Archer, who had saved 6 months of seamstress wages to buy a pocket watch for a man she loved, who had come west and made a home and died young in a bad winter, leaving behind a son who had her eyes and her patience, and apparently, by some miracle of inheritance, her understanding that love is not a feeling that happens to you but a thing you build with your hands and your presence and your daily choice to keep showing up. On Saturday she put on the best dress she owned, blue wool with white buttons at the cuff, not extravagant but good, the kind of dress that says, "I understand this is important." She arranged her hair. She looked in the mirror and thought, "I have been so careful for so long. I have been so careful not to want things I could not have." And then she put on her hat and went and got her horse. Joseph had made beef stew with biscuits and an apple pie from the tree in the yard, and the table was set with the good dishes that had been his mother's blue and white china that had traveled from somewhere east, fragile survivors of all the years and distance. He had put wildflowers in a jar in the center, the small yellow ones that bloomed along the creek in August, and when she walked in and saw all of this, she had to look at the ceiling briefly to keep herself composed. They ate, they talked, the particular pleasure of being with someone whose mind you trust and whose presence makes the ordinary things more interesting. She would think later that this was the most elegant definition she knew of love, and she would think it every day for the rest of her life. After supper, he cleared the dishes and then went to the desk in the study and came back with something in his hand. He stood on the other side of the kitchen table, the same counter that had held the pocket watch in April, the same light, the same kitchen, but entirely different in temperature, in the quality of the air between them, and he held out a ring. It was a simple thing. A narrow gold band with a small garnet set in silver, modest and lovely, and very clearly chosen by someone who understood that a ring is not an advertisement for wealth but an expression of intention. It was, she knew without being told, Eleanor Archer's ring. "My mother wore this her whole married life," Joseph said. "My father kept it because he couldn't bear to sell it even when the money was very short. I have been keeping it because—" He stopped. Started again more directly. "I would like you to have it if you'll have me. I would like to marry you, Harriet. I would like to build whatever comes next with you on this land, between this house and yours, and I would like it to be a real marriage, the kind where two people actually see each other. I know we haven't known each other long in the formal sense. I know there's history to navigate and people will say things. I know I'm not a man who makes the easy choice or the showy gesture, but I can promise you that when I say I love you, it is the most considered statement I have ever made in my life, and it will not change." She looked at him across the table with those quiet green eyes that had been cataloging him since April, since the moment he had said stay, and she had turned around and seen his face and thought, "There is someone in there I need to know." She looked at him with the full force of her careful, honest, precisely calibrated self, and she said, "Yes, Joseph, I would like that very much." He came around the table and took her left hand and put the ring on her finger, and it fit, which she took as the kind of sign that the practical-minded part of her brain usually rejected, and the rest of her brain was very willing to accept. He kissed her then, really kissed her, not the careful forehead gesture of June, but something that said, "I mean all of this, all of what I said, and I am not frightened of how much I mean it." She kissed him back with equal conviction and equal intention, and the blue and white dishes sat on the table between the empty plates and the wildflowers, and Pilgrim made some noise in the barn that was probably irrelevant, and the August stars began to appear over the New Mexico territory, and it was, by any honest measure, a very good evening. They were married in October. The wedding was held at the Cimarron church, a small affair by some standards, significant by others. The town did talk, as predicted, but the talk was more surprised than scandalized, because both Joseph and Harriet were known to be serious, private people with reputations for good dealing, and the water rights arrangement they had publicly filed in Santa Fe had already reframed the Archer Quinn narrative in a way that made their marriage feel less like a betrayal of family loyalties and more like a conclusion to a long and wasteful conflict. Cass, Harriet's foreman, attended and brought his wife, which was a kind of endorsement that meant more to her than any formal blessing. A few of the neighboring ranchers attended with their families. Sheriff Hendricks attended in his official capacity and seemed genuinely pleased by the occasion, as though it resolved something in his own ledger of the valley's unfinished business. Joseph wore a good dark coat she had not seen before, which told her he had ridden to Taos to find it, which she thought was the most specific and touching kind of effort. She wore her blue dress, the good one, with a new white shawl she had made herself through the September evenings, sitting in the Quinn Ranch study surrounded by her father's books and thinking about the future with something she had almost forgotten how to feel. The preacher read the words and they said the words, and Joseph placed Eleanor's garnet ring properly on her finger. It had come off briefly, necessarily, for the ceremony, and going back on it felt definitive in a way that nothing else in the day quite matched. He held her hand so carefully, as though the ring and the hand and the whole of what they contained were things he intended to take very good care of, and she believed him completely. They rode back to the Archer Ranch together in the gold October afternoon, which was where they had decided to make their base. The Archer house was in better condition and had more space, and they would work the two properties together, the Quinn land and the Archer land, a joining that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago and now felt, as most right things do, like the most logical conclusion in the world. The Quinn ranch house they kept. They hired a couple young newlyweds from a family in Cimarron who needed the position to manage the Quinn spread day to day, which provided employment and ensured the land was well tended, and Harriet rode south twice a week to oversee it. This was an arrangement that suited her independence and suited Joseph's recognition of that independence, which was one of the foundational things between them from the beginning, the mutual acknowledgement that each of them was a complete person who had chosen this and was not simply completing the other. The winter of 1877 was cold and clear, and the best winter Harriet Quinn Archer could remember. They worked and read and talked through the long evenings by the kitchen stove, and she reorganized his pantry and he read everything she put in front of him, and they disagreed about things land management approaches, the politics of the territory, the proper method of making biscuits with the genuine engagement of two people who were interested in each other's opinions even when those opinions were wrong, and they were both occasionally wrong, and both capable of acknowledging it. She discovered that he was a quietly funny man, which she had suspected from the beginning and which proved to be entirely true, the dry, unexpected variety of funny that does not announce itself and is therefore twice as good when it arrives. He discovered that she was capable of quite significant stubbornness when she thought she was right, which he found, to his own mild surprise, not irritating but admirable. He told her, one February evening when the fire was low and the snow was moving against the window, about the woman in Abilene, more than he had before. How young he had been, how certain, how the rejection had reconfigured something in him that had taken a long time to rebuild. He told it without complaint, only with the honesty of someone who has processed a painful thing thoroughly enough to describe it clearly. She told him about the years in the Quinn marriage, the specific loneliness of being with someone who was not unkind, but was simply not present in the ways she needed. She told him about the books she had kept stacked by her bedside, how they had been a kind of company, how she had filled the gap with them in the way that people fill gaps with whatever is at hand, and that she was grateful for those books and always would be, but that she was even more grateful not to need them that way anymore. "Do you need them now?" he asked without jealousy, genuinely curious. "I want them now," she said. "That's different. Now they're pleasure, before they were survival." He reached across and took her hand in the fire-lit room and held it, and they sat in the fine silence of two people who have exactly what they need and know it. Spring came back to the Cimarron Valley in its extravagant southwestern way, the wild irises in the creek bottoms, the cottonwood leaves bursting small and electric green, the red cliffs burning against the blue sky. Pilgrim, fully rehabilitated from whatever original trauma had made him difficult, was proving to be one of the best horses on the ranch, willing and intelligent and fond of Harriet in particular, which Joseph noted with an expression of fond exasperation. In April, a year after Harriet had first walked through the Archer gate with the pocket watch, she told Joseph she was going to have a child. She told him in the kitchen, in the evening, and she watched his face very carefully because she wanted to see the exact moment the information arrived, the private, unguarded instant before a person has organized their response. What she saw was not surprise they had hoped for this, but something vast and vulnerable, the expression of a man who has constructed very careful defenses against hoping for things, and has just discovered those defenses completely inadequate. He came around the table and put his arms around her with such care, such specific, deliberate care, and she felt his face against her hair and his arms steady and certain, and she thought, This is what I came west for. Not the land, not the practical life, not even the freedom from my father's debts. This moment, this person, this particular and irreplaceable feeling of being entirely, accurately known and still held. The child was born in November 1878, a boy, arriving with the serious efficiency of someone who had decided to get on with things. They named him William for no ancestor in particular, only because they both said it aloud in the same hour, and it felt right, which was the method by which they made most of their best decisions. William Archer was, from the first days, a serious and alert baby with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, and an expression that suggested he was cataloging information about the world and reserving judgment until further data was available. Harriet nursed him through the winter nights in the chair by the bedroom window, looking out at the star-brilliant New Mexico sky, and felt the profound, specific fullness of a life that had traveled a very long and sometimes terrifying route to arrive somewhere genuinely good. Joseph was a father the way she had known he would be, careful and present, and not remotely embarrassed about his tenderness, which was its own quiet revolution for a man who had been raised in the particular frontier tradition of not showing soft feelings. She watched him hold his son in the mornings when the light came gold through the curtains, watched the way William grabbed his father's finger, and Joseph looked at the small, determined fist with an expression so naked and complete that she had to look away sometimes, not because it was difficult to witness, but because it was almost too full to hold. The water arrangement continued to function well through its second year. Their combined operation of the two properties had proven more efficient than either individually. They had consolidated their cattle management, shared equipment, and approached the territory's market together rather than as competitors. The Quinn hands and the Archer hands had initially treated each other with the inherited suspicion of their employers' histories, but by the end of the first year, they had achieved the practical comradeship of people who work together toward shared goals and find the old grievances increasingly abstract. Cass remained the Quinn foreman and a loyal right hand to Harriet, and he and Joseph had developed the particular wordless understanding of two competent men who respect each other's areas of expertise and do not require conversation to communicate it. Harriet found this deeply satisfying in the same way that watching two well-crafted mechanisms work in harmony is satisfying. The summer of 1879 brought a new challenge. A speculator from Denver, a man named Fairweather, who had taken an interest in the Cimarron Valley and had been quietly buying out smaller homesteaders to consolidate a large land holding. His methods were legal in the narrowest sense. He bought at fair prices, or prices that looked fair until you understood that he had been manipulating the water access to small properties to make them less viable before making his offers. It was, Harriet recognized with cold clarity, the same basic strategy Douglas Quinn had used against Walter Archer, scaled up and applied systematically. Several of their neighbors had already sold. When Fairweather's representative appeared at the Archer gate in July with a purchase offer, Joseph listened to the full presentation with his characteristic patience and then declined, precisely and without hostility. The representative suggested the offer might not be available indefinitely. Joseph said he understood, and the representative was welcome to leave. That evening, Joseph and Harriet sat at the kitchen table with a map of the valley and talked through what they knew of Fairweather's water manipulation strategy. She had been following the details of the smaller sales and had noticed the pattern. He had noticed the pattern as well but had not had the precise mechanism articulated until she laid it out, which was one of the specific pleasures of their partnership. They saw different things and the combined vision was more complete than either alone. If we can demonstrate the water manipulation to the territorial court, the prior sales might be contestable, she said. The affected families may have grounds. That requires documentation, he said. And it requires those families to be willing to take on the legal cost and time of a challenge. I can help with the documentation. I know how to build a factual record. She paused. Perhaps if we approach the affected families together and present the strategy and the potential remedy, some of them will see the value in collective action. Joseph looked at her across the map. You are, without question, the most useful person I have ever met, he said, in the affectionate, fully meaning it tone that had replaced his earlier careful gravity, not because the seriousness had left him, but because with her he had found the room to also be warm. "You're not doing badly yourself," she said. They spent 3 months building the documentation. She drafted the legal framework, researched the territorial codes, wrote carefully constructed letters to the affected families. He rode to each neighboring property in person, which carried a different kind of weight than letters the physical presence of Joseph Archer, who was known in the valley as a man of his word, explaining what he understood about what Fairweather had done and inviting them to consider their options together. 6 families ultimately joined the effort. Sheriff Hendricks, who had been watching Fairweather's consolidation with growing unease, and was relieved to have a legal rather than violent avenue to pursue, provided what documentation he could from his own records. A sympathetic lawyer in Santa Fe, a man named Robles who had handled the original water rights filing and respected Harriet's methodical approach, agreed to represent the collective challenge on a deferred fee arrangement. Fairweather's operation in the Cimarron Valley did not survive the challenge. The territorial court found sufficient evidence of the water manipulation to void 3 of the smaller land sales and to subject Fairweather to significant penalties. He departed the valley in the spring of 1880, and 2 of the 3 voided families returned to their properties, and the 3rd chose to sell legitimately, at their own election, and at a fair price to a young couple from Colorado who were exactly the kind of solid, hard-working settlers who had always been the actual substance of the frontier, as opposed to its mythology. The valley had arrived at something like equilibrium. Not perfect, the injustices of previous years could not be fully undone, and the water rights situation still required active management, and there were other Fairweathers out there, other speculative interests circling the territory. But the immediate threat was resolved, and the community had discovered that collective, legally grounded action was more effective than isolation. There was a dinner at the Cimarron Community Hall in the fall of 1880, a celebration of sorts, a harvest gathering that functioned as a quiet acknowledgement of what the valley had managed together. Harriet sat at the table with William, now almost 2 years old and conducting an intense personal investigation of everything within reach, and with Joseph beside her, talking to the neighboring rancher on his other side, and she looked around the table at faces she had come to know over 3 years, Cass and his wife, the Hendrickses, the 2 families who had returned to their properties, young Robles who had made the trip up from Santa Fe for the occasion, and she thought about the 1st April. The pocket watch on the counter, the question she had not expected, and the staying she had not planned. She thought about all the things that had to be true simultaneously for this moment to exist, the terrible history between the families, which had made the returning of the watch necessary, the specific quality of Joseph's character, which had allowed the staying to be safe, her own stubborn, careful honesty, which had made it possible for them to build what they had built without the foundations rotting underneath it. The past was not erased. Walter Archer and Douglas Quinn were still in the ground at the edges of a story no one would ever fully know, and the water rights argument, and the long-voided agreement, and the things that had been said at fence lines were real and had happened, and continued to shape the landscape in ways both literal and metaphorical. The acknowledgement of that was important. She had never wanted to pretend it away. But the future was real too, and it was sitting beside her with his dark, serious eyes and his warm hand on her shoulder, and it was sitting in her lap with its green eyes and its father's perpetual expression of evaluating the world, and it was in the ring on her finger that had once been a leaner Archer's and was now hers, carrying the memory of a woman she would never know but felt she understood. The seamstress who had saved 6 months to buy a watch for a man she loved, who had packed that love into a small silver case and sent it forward through time where it would eventually, in ways she could never have imagined, find its way back to something like completion. William said something emphatic in the private language of toddlers and grabbed a bread roll off the table with both hands, and Joseph turned from his conversation and looked at his son with that vast, naked expression, and then looked at Harriet, and the expression shifted, became the adult, fully articulated version of it. "I know exactly what I have, and I do not take a single day of it for granted," and she felt it land in her chest like a stone dropped in still water, the ripples spreading outward to everything she was and everything she had made. She put her hand over his on the table. He turned it over and held hers. Around them, the valley's people talked and ate, and the children ran between the tables, and the lamplight held the autumn dark at bay. And somewhere in Joseph's vest pocket the silver watch ticked on, steady and small and faithful, carrying its own inscription into whatever came next. Time passed in the way that good time passes, full and fast and generously, the days distinct enough to be remembered and similar enough to be peaceful. William grew from a serious baby into a serious small boy with his grandfather's apothecary interests, and his father's patience with animals, and his mother's absolute refusal to accept an explanation that did not make complete sense. He became Pilgrim's particular friend and guardian, spending long summer afternoons at the fence of the paddock, talking to the horse in the same low, steady register Harriet had used, which she noticed and felt something almost too large to name. In the spring of 1882, Harriet told Joseph they were expecting again. This time he was ready, or as ready as a person ever is for something that arrives with its own complete and uncontainable reality, and his face when she told him held less of the vulnerable shock and more of the warm, settled certainty of a man who has learned to receive good things without flinching. The second child was a girl. They named her Clara, at William's suggestion actually, offered with the gravity of a 3-year-old who has been consulted about an important matter and takes the responsibility seriously. Clara Eleanor Archer arrived in December 1882 with copper lights in her dark hair and a set of opinions that she communicated loudly and without apology from the first hours of her existence. She was, from the beginning, entirely herself. The Quinn Ranch property flourished under the management couple. The pair had 2 children of their own by now, and had grown into the land with the deep-rootedness of people who had found exactly the place they needed. Harriet continued to oversee the Quinn operations, which had been gradually integrated with the Archer Ranch operations into a single efficient enterprise that required the combined skills of both of them to manage well. She had extended her careful record-keeping into a general system for both properties that would have been recognizable to any Boston accountant, and was entirely unique in the Cimarron Valley. She had also, gradually, become the person the Valley's women came to when they needed someone who could read a legal document or draft a letter, or explain what a contract actually said as opposed to what they were being told it said. This was not a formal arrangement. She had never sought it, but she was known to be competent and honest and not condescending, and women who needed help with the business side of frontier life found their way to her, and she helped them, and the network this created was informal but real and was, she thought, one of the more genuinely useful things she did. Joseph was aware of all this and supported it completely, which was not nothing in 1882, and she did not pretend it was nothing. He had on more than one occasion sat at the kitchen table with a neighboring woman's contract spread before him and his own opinion offered when she asked for it, in addition to Harriet's, which added the weight of a male voice in a world where that weight still counted unfairly, and he was clear-eyed about the unfairness, and willing to use what he had in the service of what was right. There was a morning in the summer of 1883, the summer William turned 5, and Clara turned 8 months, and Harriet turned 33, when Joseph and Harriet rode out early together, before the heat built, leaving William with Cass's wife and Clara with the management couple's wife, the rare luxury of 2 horses and 2 people, and the wide-open morning with no obligations except to be in it together. They rode north, past the Archer pastures, past the spring that was running clear and cool, up into the cedar-juniper country where the air smelled of resin and the high desert opened out to a view that on clear days showed you 100 miles of territory. The mountains and the mesas and the long red line of the cliffs, and the small, brave assertion of human habitation in the middle of it all. They stopped on the high ground and sat their horses and looked at it for a long time without speaking, because some things do not need language, only witness. "My father brought me up here once," Joseph said eventually. "I was 9 or 10. He said a man should know the size of the country he's trying to make a life in, so he doesn't make the mistake of thinking it's smaller than it is." Was he right? "About that," Joseph said, with the specific precision of a man who has held complicated feelings about his father for a long time and has arrived at a fair accounting. "Yes." Harriet looked at the long view. She thought about Walter Archer bringing a 10-year-old boy up here to teach him the scale of things. She thought about Eleanor Archer, who had not lived to bring anyone here. She thought about Douglas Quinn, who had never talked to her about scale or beauty or any of the things that made a place worth fighting over, only about the fighting itself. "Do you think they knew what they were ruining?" she said. "Our father's your father, my husband. Do you think they understood the cost of what they were spending on their argument?" "I think they understood it differently than we do," Joseph said. "I think they saw the land and the water as things to be won, and winning mattered more than what was lost in the winning. I don't think they were wrong to care about the land. I think they were wrong about how it worked." He paused. "I think the land isn't something you win. It's something you tend, and you can't tend anything well when you're spending all your attention on the opposition." Harriet turned to look at him. "When did you work that out?" "Gradually," he said. "Assisted considerably by a woman who rode to my gate one April with a pocket watch and more courage than strictly required for the errand." She laughed, a real, full laugh that the high desert air carried away north. "I was terrified," she said. "I had rehearsed what to say so many times it had become meaningless. And then I walked in and you were just there, and nothing I had rehearsed was right for you, so I just said the actual thing." "That is one of the things I love most about you," he said. "You just say the actual thing." "It's efficient," she said. "It's rare," he said. She held his gaze in the bright morning. Eleanor Archer's ring caught the light on her finger. The high desert spread around them in every direction, vast and indifferent and gorgeous, the kind of landscape that reduces human troubles to their appropriate size without reducing the humans themselves. Here at the top of the morning, it was possible to see that Douglas Quinn and Walter Archer and their long and bitter waste of each other were not the whole story of this valley, that the valley itself had larger business in mind, longer purposes, and that the people willing to tend rather than fight were the ones it would reward. She reached over and touched the pocket watch through the fabric of his vest. She could feel the shape of it, the familiar small weight. "We should head back," she said. "Clara will be wanting her breakfast, and William will have worn out Cass's wife with questions about the natural world." "Probably," he said, but he caught her hand before she could pull it back and held it for a moment in both of his in the high morning air. "Thank you," he said. It was the kind of thank you that means more than any of its components, not for one specific thing but for the accumulated everything. "You're welcome," she said. "Same kind of welcome." They turned their horses south and rode home together, down through the cedar and juniper into the pasture country, the spring running bright where they crossed it, Pilgrim's distant shape visible at the north fence, the small necessary world of their making visible and solid and alive ahead of them. The years continued to compound in the generous way that happy years do. William turned 7, then 10, then 12, all while developing into a person of considerable intellectual rigor and the specific frontier practicality of someone who had grown up understanding that ideas had to survive contact with actual ground. He read everything on the ranch bookshelf, including his grandmother's medical book from Boston, which Harriet had brought with her when they consolidated the Quinn House library with the Archer study. And at 11, he announced that he intended to study medicine, with the same settled certainty with which he stated most things that turned out to be true. Clara turned 5, then 8, with her brother's seriousness and something else, something more combustible, a quality that expressed itself variously as remarkable artistic ability, complete inability to accept unfairness without comment, and a relationship with the horses that was, even by the standards of a family of capable riders, exceptional. She had been on horseback since she could sit upright, and she rode with the natural ease of someone who had negotiated with animals in some previous existence and simply remembered how. In 1887, Harriet found she was expecting for the third time, which arrived as a surprise, a welcome one, but definite evidence that life was not finished having ideas. She was 37, which she noted to Joseph with the particular combination of wonder and practicality that characterized her relationship to the unexpected. He was 40, the same combination, differently expressed. The third child, born in the early spring of 1888, was a boy, small and intensely vigorous, dark-haired like his father and his brother, and apparently determined to make up in energy what his siblings had expressed in intellectual gravity. They named him James, for no ancestor and no specific reason except that it suited him immediately and completely, and James Archer grew up in a household where seriousness and warmth and honest dealing were the fabric of daily life, and where the story of the pocket watch was told to all 3 children when they were old enough to understand it properly. Harriet told it the first time to William when he was about 8. She did not dramatize it or simplify it. She told it the way she told most things, precisely and honestly, with the full weight of the history and the full acknowledgement that people who were not evil had done wrong things, and that the righting of those wrongs had required more than one person's willingness to act, and that the result was the family sitting in this kitchen, which was the result she was most glad of. William listened to the whole story with his characteristic stillness, and then said, "So the watch belongs to us now, all of us." "In a sense," Harriet said. "Then we should keep it very carefully," he said. Joseph, who had been listening from the doorway, came in and set the watch on the table and said, "We will. All 3 of us, and you can carry it someday when you're grown if you like." William considered the watch for a long moment, the same silver case, the hunting scene on the back, the inscription inside from a leaner to Walter, for Walter with all that I am. He did not open it this time, only held it, feeling the weight of it. "It's very heavy," he said, with the literal precision of a child, but both his parents understood exactly what he meant. The Cimarron Valley in the 1880s and early 1890s was a different place from the one Harriet had arrived in 1874. Not unrecognizably different, still fundamentally a frontier community, still raw at the edges, still governed by the interplay of isolation and interdependence that the land itself enforced, but layered with the accumulated decisions of 15 years of people trying to get it right. The water management system that had begun with a spring and a jointly filed agreement had been extended, with the cooperation of several neighboring properties, into something that approached a rational watershed plan for the valley. It was not perfect, and it was not permanent, but it was better than what preceded it, and it had prevented at least 2 of the kinds of conflicts that had destroyed families in the previous generation. Harriet's informal legal assistance network had evolved into something more formal. She had eventually connected with a women's advocacy organization based in Albuquerque that was working on property rights for women in the territory, and she had contributed both documentation and testimony to several cases that resulted in real, if incremental, expansions of what the law would recognize. She was not a lawyer and could not be, the territory did not permit it, but she was as close to one as the valley had, and she used what she had the way Joseph used the land, carefully, consistently, toward ends that outlasted any individual effort. Joseph, for his part, had become the informal arbitration point for disputes in the northern valley. Not the sheriff. Hendricks had retired and been replaced by a younger man named Vega, who was both more energetic and more systematic. But the person people came to before a dispute escalated to the point that the sheriff's office was necessary. This was partly his reputation and partly his method. He listened completely before speaking, asked questions that clarified rather than complicated, and had a well-known habit of proposing solutions that cost both parties something and therefore felt fair to both parties, which was more important than the solutions being objectively optimal. He remained a quiet man. He was more at ease now than he had been in those first April months, the sharp edges worn smoother not by reduction, but by context, by the presence of a house that held the people he loved and work that meant something, and a life that had turned out to be larger and more full than he had imagined when he came back from Texas to bury his father and settle in a state he had not expected to want. There was an evening in 1891, September, the light going gold and long across the valley, when all five of them were on the porch. William was 13, doing something with a book of anatomical diagrams. Clara was 9, working on a drawing of Pilgrim. Pilgrim was very old now, moving slowly, and Clara had appointed herself his personal chronicler with the systematic dedication of someone who understood that things do not last and should therefore be recorded. James was 3, conducting an investigation of a beetle near the porch step with the focused intensity that characterized his engagement with the natural world. Harriet was mending. Joseph was reading the territorial newspaper. The evening was warm and the creak could be heard from the porch if you were listening, and someone's cattle were moving in the distance, the hollow knock of a bell cow. It was not an extraordinary evening. It was the definition of ordinary, of the most ordinary kind of domestic peace that requires nothing remarkable to be perfect. Joseph looked up from his paper and looked at his family on the porch: James and the beetle, Clara and her drawing, William and his diagrams, Harriet and her mending, and he reached into his vest pocket and took out the silver watch and looked at it for a moment, not checking the time, just holding it. Harriet looked up and saw him looking at it, and their eyes met over the space of the porch, and she understood exactly what he was thinking, because she was thinking the same thing: the long and improbable journey from the counter in April 1877, the returned watch, the staying she had not planned, the ring she had not expected, the life that had grown from the wreckage of two families' worst choices, the life that was here on this porch in the September evening, entirely and unmistakably good. She held up her left hand slightly, the garnet ring catching the last light. He closed the watch and put it back in his pocket and returned to his newspaper, but he was smiling. William looked up from his diagrams and looked at his parents doing whatever silent communication they were doing and said, with the air of someone filing information for future reference, "You two are very strange." "Agreed," said Clara, without looking up from her drawing. "Beetle," said James, pointing. Harriet laughed. Joseph laughed. William shook his head and went back to his book with the tolerant exasperation of the eldest child who has long since accepted that his parents are unaccountably pleased with each other, and has decided this is, on balance, preferable to the alternative. The light went gold, then copper, then the first cool blue of the western evening, and the valley settled into itself around the house and the family on the porch, and the watch ticked in Joseph's pocket, and the ring was warm on Harriet's hand, and the creek ran on below the cottonwoods, and the three children went indoors one by one as the stars came out. And at the last of the light, Harriet and Joseph sat alone on the porch the way they had sat beside the creek on that first picnic in June 1877, in the easy silence that was its own conversation. "I think about April sometimes," he said. "The watch on the counter." "So do I. I almost didn't ask you to stay." "What stopped you from not asking?" He thought about it. "You looked like someone who had done a very hard thing very carefully and was ready to leave without knowing if it had mattered. I could not let that happen." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was something she did in the evenings when the day was over and the house was quiet, a small, complete, habitual gesture of presence. "It mattered," she said. "Everything that came from it mattered," he said. Above them, the stars of the New Mexico territory blazed in their thousands, exactly as they had blazed the night she first rode home from his ranch with the empty map case and the head full of unplanned thoughts, exactly as they had blazed every night since, indifferent to the small human dramas below them, but brilliant and generous and fully present. The same sky over the Quinn land and the Archer land, over the spring and the creek and the old fence lines, over the grave of Walter Archer and the grave of Douglas Quinn, and the lives of everyone they had shaped and damaged and inadvertently sent on the long, strange course that had ended here, in this moment, in this rightness. The watch ticked, the ring gleamed, the valley breathed. And Harriet Quinn Archer, who had come west with nothing but her own intelligence and a willingness to do hard things, and who had found in the hardest thing she had ever done riding north with a dead man's watch and a rehearsed speech, and a hope she would not yet admit to herself, the beginning of everything she had always actually been looking for, closed her eyes and felt the stars and the valley and the evening and the warmth of his shoulder and thought, "I am exactly where I belong." She had been exactly where she belonged for 14 years. She intended to be there for a great many more. In the Quinn family Bible, the one Harriet had brought from Boston, the one that had survived 2 houses and 15 years and all the rest of it, the record of the family was written in her hand, the clear, precise Boston hand that the frontier had not softened. William James Archer, born November 1878. Clara Eleanor Archer, born December 1882. James Walter Archer, born March 1888. She had given the middle name carefully. Walter, for the man she had never met, whose watch had started all of this, whose love for his wife had been preserved in a small silver case and carried forward through everything into the hands of the grandson who would someday carry it. On the page before the birth records in the same hand she had written a single line as a kind of preface to all the rest of it. "A wrong acknowledged is not yet a right made, but it is the only road there is." Joseph had read it and said nothing for a moment and then said, "Your father said that." "No," she said. "I did." He read it again. "Yes, you did," he said with that warm certainty, and she understood he meant it about more than the sentence. She put the Bible on the shelf with her father's medical book, and the novel she had given Joseph in June 1877, and the book of natural philosophy, and the shelf held all of it, the old life and the new life, and the books that had been company and then pleasure, and the family that had come from a pocket watch returned across the divide of history and grief, and the valley outside the window that did not care about human stories but held them anyway. Patient and permanent and red in the long southwestern light. The watch ticked in his pocket. The ring was warm on her hand. And the story, which had begun with the most unlikely beginning imaginable, had arrived at exactly the ending it deserved.